Welcome to the R&L Revolution Nothing Less show. This is our 174th episode on November 16th, 2023. My name is Andy Z. I'm the host of the show, coming to you from Los Angeles, California. This is a show about and for nothing else and nothing less than an actual revolution. This is a show, the only show, that has the way for people here and around the world to be able to work and struggle together to overcome all of the brutal exploitation and oppression, the wars and the devastation of the environment that is caused by the system we live under, the dog-eat-dog, people and climate-killing system of capitalism imperialism. We are working for a revolution in a time when billions of people here and around the world feel that the future is in danger. This is a time when those who rule in this country, the fascist Republican Party of Trump, and Biden's Democratic Party of war and perpetuating the normal oppression of the masses of people here and around the world, where these two parties are so deeply divided that they cannot come together. This is leading things towards a truly terrible, brutal future. Yet because these rulers are at each other's throats, and that life in this country will not be as it has been for generations, this sharpening situation opens up the possibility for masses of people to be brought to see that in opposition to where these rulers are hurtling society, there is a whole other, far better, emancipating way we could be living through a real revolution. But for that to happen requires solid, serious, revolutionary leadership. Leadership not afraid to struggle with the masses of people, to see that all the problems we face are rooted in the system of capitalism imperialism, and that system cannot be reformed. It needs to be overthrown through a real revolution, to bring it to being a radically new and far better system as put forward in the Constitution for a new socialist republic in North America, written by the revolutionary leader Bob Avakian. Bob Avakian, who we often refer to as BA, has developed the strategic orientation and a practical approach to preparing now and organizing for that revolution. And in today's R&L show, we're going to be hearing from Bob Avakian on a central part of the strategy for preparing for revolution that is expressed in the slogan, "Fight the power and transform the people for revolution." Again, welcome to the R&L show, the voice of revolution to emancipate humanity. The co-host of the R&L show, Saree Taylor, won't be with us today as she's in Chicago for a screening of a special theatrical showing of selections from the BA interviews on the R&L show, where she's going to be leading a question and answer session. But before she left, Saree recorded a sharp piece on Joshua in the Bible and what this tells us about the situation in Israel and Palestine today. We're going to feature this in our special Thanksgiving show next Thursday, so watch it with your family to find out what Joshua has to do with the horror going down in Gaza. And for our patrons, we're going to post this piece from Saree on Monday. On today's R&L show, in addition to Bob Avakian from the interviews we did with him on this show, we're going to have a segment from Raymond Lotta refuting the reckless and dangerous words from Yale professor and author Timothy Snyder that he spoke on MSNBC last week. And also up today, we have an interview that I did with Saree Makdisi earlier this week. Saree Makdisi is a Palestinian-American professor of English at UCLA, and he's also an author. But first, I want to welcome Annie Day, a regular contributor to the R&L show, on the struggle to stop the U.S.-backed Israeli genocidal war against Palestine in Gaza and the West Bank.
Millions are watching the genocidal assault on the Palestinian people unfold, on social media and in the news. They're being jolted, agonizing about what is happening, why, and what can be done to make it stop. Biden is aggressively and forcefully backing Israel, and most of the Democratic Party leaders are right in line. The rulers of this system, who are otherwise deeply divided, are in unity in backing Israel to the hilt. And the more that this Israeli assault on Palestinians intensifies, increases the danger of wider war, which carries an existential threat to humanity. In the face of this, Tens of thousands in the U.S. are taking to the streets to demand a ceasefire. Anti-Zionist Jews have taken the lead with defiant civil disobedience, taking over intersections, federal buildings, train stations, and more, declaring, "Not in our name," that never again must mean never again for anyone. Campuses are in turmoil, with pro-Palestinian students defying repressive moves to silence them as they face threats on their lives and careers. The protests are multinational, with many Black students and professors seeing a link to the struggle against white supremacy in this country. Just this week, more than 500 political appointees and staff members representing some 40 government agencies sent a letter to Biden protesting his support of Israel in its war on Gaza. This followed an open letter signed by more than 1,000 employees of the U.S. Agency for International Development calling for a ceasefire. And all this is being met with repression and attempts to bully people into silence and submission. This resistance needs to spread. It needs to broaden, with people from every section of society raising their voice to say no, to call out the crimes of their government. It needs to deepen, with an increased understanding of the source of this terror in the system of capitalism imperialism. And people need to learn about the need and the basis for an actual revolution to overthrow that system, and the possibility for a fundamentally different system and a whole new way to live. Right now, everyone who cares about all children everywhere needs to be part of standing up against these war crimes and crimes against humanity. And those who understand that the problem is this system of imperialism need to bring that into these protests. This understanding is otherwise absent, and it needs to be fought for. Those of you who watch the Bob Avakian Interviews and this show bring this revolution and leadership right into the midst of this struggle. And revolutionaries should be struggling for the fact that there is a way out of this through an actual revolution. There's a force you can join. There is leadership for this and a strategic approach to go all out for revolution with a real chance to win. And that chance could come sooner than you think. While millions are being jolted to the reality of this system, major advances need to and can be made in putting a revolutionary pole out in society and for the revolutionary forces to grow. For people to see that this genocide on the Palestinian people and that all the other horrors facing humanity are rooted in this system, which needs to be overthrown through a real revolution. This is a time people need to know about and get with the revcoms. And this time is not ours to waste. Stop the US-backed Israeli genocidal war against Palestine. The Palestinian people must be free. Down with the racist apartheid state of Israel and its master US imperialism. Stop the repression, censorship, and blacklisting of pro-Palestinian voices. From the imperialist USA to Palestine, the people need real revolution based on the new communism.
Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to speak with Saree Makdisi, a Palestinian-American professor of English at UCLA. Saree Makdisi's most recent book is titled Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial. He is a scholar of the British literary romantic movement and imperial culture. Over the past 5 weeks, he has been publishing and speaking extensively in major media on the horrific situation in Gaza. His critique of Western media reporting has been sharp, and in the face of the unspeakable situation in Gaza, he has provided a moral compass. We're going to play a portion of my interview with Saree Makdisi today. I want to begin with a question I posed to him about the slogan "From the River to the Sea." In asking Professor Makdisi, I referenced that he has written how for many Palestinians, this is not a call for the eradication of the Jewish people, but rather a call for a new, different state constituted on the basis of inclusion, democracy, and equality for all, as he wrote. And I added that this slogan has been weaponized by the ruling class, including Congress, to suppress the movement in support of the Palestinians. And then, ironically, this was a slogan put forward by the far-right Likud party as part of their platform in 1977. Now, the Likud is the party of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the leader of Israel today, who is leading the genocide in Gaza. So let's go to Saree Makdisi.
So there's this sense, so that expression from the river to the sea is talking about all of the land of what we call historical Palestine. And the question is, what kind of polity should correspond to that territory? And obviously, the Zionist vision of that space, and it's not just the Likud party of 1977, it's actually literally woven into Israeli law. So in 2018, the Israeli parliament passed a law called the Jewish nation-state law. That's one of their basic laws. It's basically like their equivalent of a constitution, effectively. It has basically quasi-constitutional status. And what it says is that only Jews should have sovereignty in this space, basically. And so what we see is a contest between, on the one hand, a vision of an ethnocratic state, or an ethnocracy, a state that gives full rights only to people from one ethnic background, and to the exclusion of others, obviously. And then on the other hand, a vision, which is the one that I subscribe to, of a state that should treat all of its citizens equally, irrespective of whether they're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, atheist, Buddhist, whatever. It shouldn't matter, right? What your personal identity is, what your beliefs are, should not have an impact on the kind of rights you have access to as the citizen of the state. And that's what this comes down to fundamentally. There's a great deal of, if you say from the river to the sea, people flip out, but some people flip out, I should say. But they don't flip out if you say, you have no problem, obviously, with the Likud saying from the river to the sea, or more importantly, the Jewish nation-state law of 2018, which is now, it's a law by an actual state that actually has political force. That's the other big thing, is that when Palestinians these days call for from the river to the sea, it's an aspiration. It's an aspiration expressing a vision of democracy and equality and secular, the foundation for a secular state that treats all of its citizens equally. Whereas the reality we have on the ground, it's not aspiration, it's legally binding. It's a constitutional state that says, no, only if you come from this background do you have access to the full range of rights. And if you don't, you don't. Basically, that's what this fundamentally comes down to. People can wrap themselves up in denial. And again, I've written a whole book about denial on the question of Palestine. But there are all kinds of extraordinary forms of denial in play. But that's fundamentally what we're talking about here. Do you believe in a state of equality or a state of inequality? And what Zionism has always stood for, by definition, is it's an exclusive vision of what a state should be. It's, if you're not Jewish, you don't have access to the state in terms of full access to the full spectrum of rights. We could talk about how this works, in fact, legally, and what the mechanisms are to exclude, for example, Palestinian citizens of the state. Obviously, it goes without saying that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem have much more restricted access to rights. Palestinians living in enforced exile you have no access to rights at all. But the people who have full access to the full range of rights afforded by the state are only its Jewish, not just Jewish citizens. In fact, Jewish people from anywhere in the world have rights, especially, for example, in terms of access to land, that Palestinians who are citizens of the state don't have access to because they're not Jewish. So that's fundamentally what this comes down to, is a struggle between a vision of equality and a vision of inequality. And the difference is, for now, the vision of inequality has an army and a state, and it's bombing and killing people, whereas the vision for equality is, it's got people around the world of goodwill, but it doesn't have an army, it doesn't have a state. That's fundamentally what this comes down to.
You talk about, in this latest article in N+1, speaking of the whole state project of Israel as a Jewish state, you say that this state project of apartheid's been since 1948, that it will be a racially exclusive enterprise involving apartheid, occupation, and death. It will only be brought to an end, you write, and a new state formed in its place, constituted on the basis of inclusion, democracy, and equality for all. This is the only way out. and its sheer straightforwardness is made clear by Gaza. If only those fences and walls were dismantled and the majority of Gazans were allowed to walk home, this entire nightmare would be brought to an end. So I just thought maybe you wanted to comment on that, and I have something to say also on it. But I think I think a lot of people haven't heard somebody supporting Palestine, Palestinian background, speaking in this way.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk first about what it means to have a Jewish state. I mean, the amazing thing is there are a lot of people on the left, liberal, progressive spectrum in the U.S. who are adamant believers in the separation of church and state, who are adamant believers in a state that doesn't discriminate on the basis of religion and so forth, or ethnicity or race or whatever. And then but they support the state of Israel. And so what's going on? And not just that, they're also adamantly opposed to the idea, let's say, of a Muslim state or a Muslim, ethnocratic or theocratic state, like, for example, Saudi Arabia to some extent, or Iran to another extent, and so forth. But the thing is, if you look at it rationally on the ground, that is how Israel functions. It's a state that gives the full range of rights only to Jewish people. Because legally speaking, this is how the state itself, this is not me, it's what the state itself says about itself. For example, the High Court of Justice itself, in a ruling in the early 1970s, says that there's no Israeli people separate from the Jewish nation. So they consider, for example, anybody who's Jewish anywhere in the world to be a member of the nation whose state they claim to be. And therefore, on the basis of that national identity, because that's what they consider Jewishness to be. It's not a religion as far as the state is concerned. It's a nationality. And so on the basis of that Jewish identity, anybody who's Jewish anywhere in the world not only can go live there, but has access to the land, which is what this fundamentally comes down to, is access to land, in a way that a Palestinian who's a citizen of the state doesn't have access to because they're not Jewish. So we're talking about a state of absolute racial discrimination, which is how it has to be understood in legal terms, in the terms of international laws about violations of apartheid, for example, and laws against discrimination and this kind of thing. And so what the alternative vision is one that's non-discriminatory. It's a state kind of like what the U.S. ought to be. We all know that unfortunately the U.S., like most states, there is of course discrimination, but like theoretically speaking, there isn't supposed to be discrimination. And so what people want is to see a state that doesn't discriminate along racial or ethnic or any other kind of lines, and that treats everybody equally. And in fact, if you look at the population of the people living in what was historical Palestine from the river to the sea, today it's roughly equal populations of Jewish Israelis on the one hand and Palestinian Muslims and Christians on the other hand. And in that whole territory, only one population has full rights. The other one has varying degrees of some rights to, like in Gaza, no rights. And so those forms of distinction need to be removed. They need to be those forms of separation, the forms of racial privilege and so forth, the racial hierarchy that the state is premised on. All that, I think, a lot of people of goodwill think that should be brought to an end, and the state needs to be reconstituted as a state of equal citizens. That's fundamentally what this is all about.
People need to understand the depravity of what is happening right now, and how this is being faced by people, in Gaza especially, but also what's going on in the West Bank. I just think it would be worthwhile talking about that, because behind the numbers are lives and people, and a project to for all the Israelis saying that the Arabs want to push us into the sea. They are right now preparing to push the people of Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula, a desert, and into a place that cannot sustain that level of life, and deny people the right of return to the country that they have been driven from over 75 years and continuing to today.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening now is it's unspeakably. I mean, it's monstrous. It really is absolutely monstrous. I mean, as you said, more than 11,000 people killed by the Israelis, about 5,000 children killed, about half the housing of Gaza already demolished. This is as of like 2 weeks ago. I mean, God knows now what it is, but that's, and in fact, even the fatality statistics, once the northern part of Gaza basically was cut off from the south because Israeli tanks were parked in between at this point, the health ministry stopped tabulating the fatalities. So we don't think the clock kind of stopped at 11,000, I don't know, 300 or 400 people at that point. And it's undoubtedly more because every single day more buildings are being bombed. And that this is the important thing. When the Israelis, they talk about, we hit this terrorist target and that terrorist. It's all, everything they're bombing are for the most part, big housing structures, like apartment buildings, residential blocks, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or more story concrete apartment buildings, basically. And the people who are being killed are civilians. That's overwhelmingly what's going on. And, here's the West, from Ursula von der Leyen to Biden to all of them saying, this is the right of self-defense. No, the right of self-defense does not involve bombing people out of their houses. It doesn't involve cutting off all supplies of food, water, electricity, fuel, and medicine to a besieged and battered population for whose welfare the Israeli state is legally accountable under international law, because the Israelis also labor under the delusion, and many people here labor under the same delusion, that it's not occupying Gaza. The UN, international law considers it the occupying power because it controls ingress and egress, the airspace, the water, the borders, everything is under Israeli control. So yeah, it is the occupying power, and therefore it's not a war between. That's the other thing, is that this often gets described in the mainstream media as a war. It's not a war. A war is between two different countries. Gaza is not a country. This is a war. It's not a war. It's a conflict between an occupying power and an occupied population. And what we're seeing is absolutely, it's heartrending, especially if you have access to it not through the U.S. mainstream media, which is giving you a very, very, very filtered sense of what's going on, because U.S. media corporations don't have reporters on the ground in Gaza, for example. They get their reports. Like CNN the other day was driving around on the back of an Israeli Jeep, more or less. Everything that they file comes through the Israeli military censor, whereas Jazeera has representatives, they have correspondents all over the Gaza Strip and elsewhere in Palestine and in Lebanon and other places too. And so they're reporting uncensored from the ground up, rushing to the scenes of newly bombed buildings. So you can see with your own eyes who's being pulled out of the rubble. It's women and children for the most part. So yeah, it's absolutely heartbreaking to see all those children, that the Israelis have managed to kill more children per day than have been killed, I don't know how many years of war in Ukraine and other places in the world. It's shattering, but that's what's going on. It is. And the other thing is that, that you don't need to turn to me or anybody else to say, well, what are they trying to do? They're saying what they're trying to do. I've quoted them in these various pieces that I've written for N+1 or other places. They're saying, no, this is a Nakba. It's an ethnic cleansing. The prime minister said this is genocidal because he's invoking the Old Testament, saying it's a genocide, like what we see in the Bible. And yeah, again, it's like you don't need 17 PhDs in literary theory to figure it out. They're telling you what it's about. It's genocide. That's what we're seeing. The question is, will they get away with it? To what extent? Yes, they can inflict massive damage, but can they actually force people out? I don't think it's going to be so easy for them to do. What will happen if they kill 15,000 people and then they stop because they're not going to accomplish their stated objective, which is the destruction of Hamas? I don't think that's going to happen. I don't know. I don't know where it's going to go. I don't think that they're necessarily thinking. I don't think that their American patrons are thinking either. That's the other thing about the American empire, by the way, is it's not an empire that intellectually seems to, function on all cylinders firing. It seems like our leadership in Washington is missing a few cylinders, to say the least, pretty much across the board. So yeah, it's what's happening is soul crushing, soul destroying, monumentally sad and depressing and upsetting. And I wish there was some silver lining to pull out, but there really isn't. If there is anything, it's that the Israelis are also pulling out. They're destroying their own base, what had been their strongest base of support, which is the U.S. at the popular level. So to go back to what we were saying at the very beginning of our discussion, if we see a growing disconnect now between the political elite in Washington and increasingly, more broad-based popular dissent, that's going to continue to grow. And the Israelis are feeding and nourishing the growth in dissent, in popular dissent against what they stand for. And in the long run, they're doing more harm to themselves. But I don't think they're thinking about the long run. I think they're just thinking, something kind of punitive and not thought through, and just kind of sort of a raw, almost primitive kind of bloodlust. Basically, is what this amounts to, and it's awful to see.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, and I hope to talk with you again. And welcome to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show.
Thank you.
And we couldn't have paid for better sound effects in the background
Yeah, it was good.
of the protest. So take care. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye now. Before we play this clip, I want to urge people in the greater New York metropolitan area to join me on Tuesday, November 28th at 7 p.m. at the Teatro SEA Theater at the Clemente Center on the Lower East Side. I'm going to be there for a talkback and Q&A after the special 1-hour selection from the BA interviews on the RNL show. These interviews are really extraordinary in giving people a living sense of why revolution is the only way out of the madness of today. How to scientifically understand the world, why the movement for revolution and the revolution itself have to embody the values of the emancipation of all of humanity and not be for revenge. And these interviews foreshadow the radically new world that really could be with the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic in North America, written by Bob Avakian. What is really unique in these interviews is seeing Bob Avakian up close and personal. You experience a leader completely different than the endless stream of bourgeois capitalist leaders who are put forward, and others who cannot see or will not look beyond the confines of this horrific system. Bob Avakian's hardcore for revolution with a largeness of mind and a generosity of spirit, and he has a lively sense of humor, all of which shines through in these interviews. Now, in today's program, we've spoken of the need for people to act against the U.S.-backed Israeli genocide in Palestine and against the repression of people standing up against this atrocity. So we're going to show the Q&A from the interviews where Bob Avakian goes into how, in standing up and fighting back against the crimes of this system, revolution can be put on the map as a real possibility, and how the organized force needed to make a real revolution can be advanced. So if you're anywhere near New York City, get tickets for you and your crew, and get in your car and Uber or the subway and join me at Teatro SEA at the Clemente Center on Tuesday evening, November 28th. So let's watch this from the interviews. You've developed as a key part of the strategy through which we could make a revolution is encapsulated in a slogan, fight the power, and transform the thinking, and transform the people for revolution. Fight the power and transform the people for revolution. And you said that the second part of this, while both are important, everything has to be for revolution, it's important. You said this tonight, that people stand up and they fight against the system and their oppression, but that the pivotal thing here is transforming the thinking of people. And people are thinking a lot of bullshit. You've brought that out very viscerally. But I want you to continue to go on this, because if we don't do this, you've made the point that if you don't transform the thinking of people, they don't get into the revolution, the world's going to stay the oppressive shithole that it is. I wanted to ask you, and just listening to those stories, how did this come to you? This has been we have to be honest, this has been a contentious issue within the movement for an actual revolution. People like the first part, but the second part, maybe not so much, because you're struggling with the very people you need to get into the revolutions.
Well, I think the point's been made, and it's important to, to understand this deeply, that, Mao said, wherever there is oppression, there will be resistance. And that's not just because Mao said it, but it's actually capturing an important part of reality. People do rise up all the time. Again, they may be, their anger may be suppressed, their outrage may be contained for a while, but eventually resistance does break forth all the time. And we see this all around us. But the question is, where is it going to go? And then it's the even more fundamental question is, what are the things that they're rebelling against? Considering that in its essential character and main aspect, its basic role, it's positive. What are the things that they're rebelling against rooted in? Because again, if you want to uproot something, you have to know what is rooted in. Mm-hmm. So people rebel, but on their own. Yes, look, this has been a big argument in the communist movement, still is. Is there something inherent, sort of, in the nature of oppressed people, that they will come to the basic desire for revolution on their own? Because, given their oppressed condition, they just kind of know that they need to make a revolution. Well, then, no. That goes back, Lenin made that point, over 100 years ago. Yes, people who are oppressed will gravitate, will be inclined toward and move toward fighting against their oppression and even wanting to eliminate it. But then there's all the larger influences of the overall society that pull them back another way. There's the daily struggle to survive for, billions of people on the planet, and masses of people in this country included. There's all the ideas that are pumped out continually from the ruling institutions and the massive machinery of molding public opinion that they have through the educational system, through the culture, through the media, just in a multidimensional way, they shape people. So yes, people may be inclined in the direction of wanting to get rid of this, but then they get pulled back on their own by all this other stuff. So their resistance is always going to end up ultimately in a dead end. And then when it ends up in a dead end, people get demoralized. They say, and people even say it to us, well, look, we fought all this, we fought so hard, so many people came out, and we couldn't even put an end to police brutality, or we couldn't even save the right to abortion, so how could we ever make a revolution? But see, that's drawing the wrong conclusion, because in order to stop police brutality, in order to ensure the rights of women, including the right to abortion, you have to get rid of the system that is going to prevent that, that's going to oppress and suppress that. So if people are left on their own, they're going to end up in a dead end, plus they're not really on their own, as we all know. There are all kinds of other forces out there promoting all kinds of different programs which remain within and lead people within the confines of the system and back into a demoralizing dead end. Defund the police is a perfect example. Or in the abortion battle, well, don't worry because we'll have the abortion pill. And not recognizing how they're going to go after that too. And plus, the masses of women don't even have access to that, even if things weren't going the way they are. But all these illusions are promoted by all these different forces. So yes, look, if people, Marx made this point, and it's a very important point. If the masses don't stand up and fight back against their oppression, they will be reduced to broken wretches who are not capable of anything higher. And just put it simply, if people are beaten down, how are they going to rise up for a revolution? So, both because it's important that people not be forced to... right now I'm reading on our website, revcom.us, about a prisoner strike in Alabama, horrific conditions that are just, unbelievable, what people are being put through. It's just like a killing place, and is it much better that people are rising up there, even though that's not going to go all the way to revolution by itself? Of course, because people shouldn't be subjected to this. And also, if they're broken, if they just are constantly broken down, how are they ever going to be able to rise up for anything bigger? So for both reasons, resistance is very important. Rebellion against oppression is very important. But then, And people have commented on this, people, when they do rise up, they raise their heads and they think about things they don't normally think about. And they're open to thinking about things they don't normally think about or don't even want to think about. So that provides more opportunity and opening to actually get with them and lead them to the solution to all this, namely revolution. But left to itself, we've seen this over and over again. It doesn't go to revolution for all the reasons I was just discussing. So people have to be transformed, and the main thing, that means transform in their thinking. It doesn't mean they have to wear different clothes. I mean, maybe in some cases that might be appropriate. I don't know. But it means transform in their thinking. In other words, in their understanding of why they're in the situation they're in. Could anything be done about it? What's the cause of it? If you understand the cause, is there a solution to that? What is that solution? And along with that, what is the morality that people have if they want to get out of all this? Is it go for yourself and fuck everybody else, or even a nicer version of that? Well, I'm doing me and you do you and we'll all get along, which doesn't lead where it needs to go. Or do they need to understand, again, what all this is rooted in? And do they need to be transformed to be fighters against all oppression, to be emancipators of humanity, to be revolutionaries aiming to emancipate people all over the world ultimately, and to see themselves as in the same fight with people all over the world who are fighting against this oppression in all different forms. See, so that this is why, even in order to continue fighting in the short run, people's sights need to be raised, and their understanding of the problem and solution on a scientific basis needs to be developed and strengthened, even in order to keep fighting short of revolution, and certainly in order to actually, once again, uproot the cause of all this. Their thinking needs to be transformed into people are trained to be unscientific. They're trained to be subjective. That is, you respond by subjective, I mean, you're the subject. And whatever happens to you, you respond personally to that. That's what we mean by subjective. You're the subject acting in the world, and whatever affects you personally, that's how you respond to it. Rather than seeing the larger picture, even the larger picture of why this is happening to you, let alone what's happening to a whole bunch of other people beyond you who are in the basic same situation that you're in. So this is what we mean that it's pivotal to transform the thinking of people. Not, it's not each one, teach one. That's, gradual, slow education. It's transforming the thinking of masses of people by going to masses of people and putting forward, like I said, in everyday language but scientifically based, why this is happening, what it's rooted in, how it relates to other things going on and other ways people are oppressed, and how we can actually get rid of all this, and therefore what your whole outlook needs to be about all this, and what your approach needs to be, and yes, what your morality needs to be in terms of what you're aiming for and what you're basing yourself on. Yes, people, go through hardship, but you're not alone in going through hardship. Billions of people are going through hardship every day, and I've made this point before. You could find a person who's suffering the worst you could imagine somewhere in Louisiana or Mississippi or New York City, and there is somebody else in the world going through even worse. So how do we understand that? How do we relate to that? Is it like, well, that's their problem, and this is my problem? Which means that neither one of you will get out of it. Or if a few of you get out of it, the masses of people won't get out of it. Or do you say, let's look for what we have in common, but more deeply than that, let's look at what it all comes from. Look, I've said a lot about science, but science is not a mystery. It's just actually engaging, reality. It's just interacting with the larger reality and then looking for what the evidence, see, that's the point that Ardea Skybreak has made, in the interview, Science and Revolution, which you can find at revcom.us. Science is an evidence-based process. It means you interact with reality, you discover the evidence about reality, and then you look at it broadly, and you analyze it, broadly, and then you bring it together, you synthesize it, you bring it together to identify what's essential about it. What are the patterns in it? What are the underlying causes of it? So this is what it means to transform the thinking of people. Everybody can take up a scientific approach. You don't have to be, look, if you're not a professional scientist, you're not going to be able to engage in a particular sphere of science the same way somebody who's a professional is. That's not what we're calling for. We're not saying everybody has to have a PhD in revolution. We're saying you can get the basic scientific method and keep on learning it as you apply it and drawing the lessons and doing that as part of a collective process where people are working and struggling with each other and helping each other understand the deeper causes of things. Everybody can do that. I don't care what your level of education is. It does, you know, you can have the Ivy League degree or you can have dropped out of school in the 5th grade. Everybody can apply science if they put themselves to it and if they're led to do it, and it's part of a collective process. And that's what we need. And people, that's what is meant by transform the thinking of people. Transform their thinking from the spontaneous ways that they're misled to misunderstand what's going on, to have a scientific approach. And with that scientific approach, you get the understanding that that grounds, that provides the foundation for a different morality, where you're not just out for yourself, because you understand that being out for yourself is not going to lead to the kind of world that we need. It's not going to lead to getting rid of all the oppression that you're being subjected to, but now you're learning about a whole bunch of other people are being subjected to. But it does correspond to maybe the dreams you've had or the hopes you've had for some kind of world where all this doesn't go on. That's what it means to transform the thinking of the people, while we're also mobilizing and uniting with people to fight the power, to fight the outrages of the system, all in order to do those 3 prepares. Prepare the ground, the political situation, prepare the masses of people, not just a few, thousands and millions ultimately, and prepare the leadership that the masses of people need, the scientifically based leadership, yes, based on the new communism as a scientific method and approach to lead those broader masses of people to actually work their way through all the contradictions you're going to encounter in order to actually break apart the system and bring it down.
In this next segment, Raymond Lotta refutes arguments put forth by Timothy Snyder on a recent MSNBC broadcast concerning the war in Ukraine. Raymond is a frequent guest on this, the RNL show. He's a political economist and a spokesperson for Revolution Books in New York City and an advocate for the new communism developed by Bob Avakian. Timothy Snyder is a professor of history at Yale University. He is a high-profile liberal anti-communist ideologue, and he is also one of the U.S. ruling class's go-to intellectual cheerleaders for America's proxy war with its imperialist rival Russia over Ukraine. We're going to show the 5-minute broadcast that Snyder did on MSNBC, and this will be followed by Raymond's commentary.
Professor Snyder, we just heard the Secretary of State say that Vladimir Putin has relied on these exact elements to wreak havoc. What are the elements here that Putin is working with that actually links his effort in Ukraine to what Hamas is doing?
Yeah, I mean, for clarity's sake, I think we should start by pointing out that there's no particular reason to think that Russia is directly behind what happened in Israel. But there is good reason, excellent reason, given Putin's own statements and Russian propaganda, to believe that Russia is rejoicing in it. So in a very broad sense, what this means is that Russia is glad to see Israel suffer, is glad to see the United States put in a difficult position as he sees it, and is not resisting, to put it mildly, the kind of rhetoric which is associated with the attack on Israel. It's not a coincidence that we just had a big pogrom inside of Russia itself. Narrowly, what the secretary has in mind is that in some sense, both Russia and Hamas are Iranian proxies in the sense that Iran helps both with weapons.
And as we go forward, Ukraine now it has to sort of battle for attention both in Washington and elsewhere because of what's now happening in Israel with Hamas.
Yeah, and it's a call upon us to think strategically. And our problem with Ukraine has never been really fatigue. I don't like that. They're the ones running the race. We're just holding the cup of Gatorade. We don't get to be fatigued. The problem with us is that we are we lack attention span. And war demands attention span. We need to be in a position as we move into the second year of this war to think about what we can do in the middle term to help the Ukrainians to win the war. We need to be thinking that way instead of talking to ourselves about how we're distracted by A, B, and C, because it's a winnable war. The Ukrainians did an extraordinary thing this summer and fall, which was to pin down the Russian Black Sea Fleet and begin to open a corridor for grain shipping. That's an extraordinary victory. They need more weapons faster in order to hurt Russian logistics and to be able to push across land next year. Those are things that we can give them. If there's any upside to the present situation, I hope it's that we will also cease listening to, Putin's threats about escalation. With so much else going on, hopefully we can get that psychological distraction out of our minds and just think about what it takes to end the war, which means winning the war.
But and we're seeing it now in the budget process in Washington. Historically, there is a dynamic in which everything competes with everything. And so there's now Ukraine funding is now in there in the same funding competitive environment as funding for Israel.
I think the president did what he had to do in the circumstances. I mean, we should keep in mind that President Biden has been dealt a very difficult hand here with these two wars. And I think his notion that one tries to get political support by bringing them two together is probably the wisest thing that could have been done. So I guess I'd like to see it not so much as a competition, but as a gesture that in this particular conjuncture of events, it's time for the United States to take clear action in two places at once, which is something that we have to be able to do. What the Republicans seem to be proposing is that we be able to take action in 0 places at once, whereas it should be natural that we can do 2 things at once.
As we go forward, what do you see as Ukraine's needs in the coming year?
That's pretty simple. So far in this war, we've allowed ourselves to be distracted by essentially Russian performance art involving nuclear war. We've allowed them to talk us into thinking that somehow we were at risk and that the real issue wasn't Ukraine. And so far in this war, we have reacted to what the Ukrainians palpably need, giving them systems that are reacting to what Russia does. In order for Ukraine to win, we have to think about what the Ukrainians proactively need, which is much more air power, which is much more what they call counter battery, much more ability to strike Russian artillery. Then we need breakthroughs in mine clearing technology, and the Ukrainians need more long range ballistic missiles, which are called ATACMS. These things are all thinkable; they can all be done. Many of these weapons are in American stockpiles, which we're going to throw away otherwise. So, I think that's the main thing. Forget about the nuclear performance art. Think about what it takes proactively rather than reacting to each Russian move.
What you just watched is an outrageous, reckless, and demagogic appeal from historian Timothy Snyder, dripping with American chauvinism, arrogance, and lunacy. A call for the U.S. imperialists to massively escalate the war in Ukraine so that Ukraine can achieve total victory over Russia with conventional weapons. A call to shrug off concern about catastrophic nuclear war. A call to give your utmost attention to this mission, because America is backing a just and noble cause. There is so much that is wrong and dangerous here. I'm going to get to Timothy Snyder's nuclear madness in a moment. But first, notice that Snyder says that Biden has been dealt a very difficult hand. Two military conflicts at the same time. Israel's war with Hamas and Ukraine's war with Russia. As though these two wars simply happened, and the U.S. is forced to act in response.
The president did what he had to do in the circumstances. I mean, we should keep in mind that President Biden has been dealt a very difficult hand here with these two wars. And I think his notion that one tries to get political support by bringing them two together is probably the wisest thing that could have been done.
This is a big lie. And Snyder is starting the movie in the middle. So we have to rewind the reel. I am not going to address Israel's genocidal slaughter in Gaza, other than to point out that historian Snyder skips over the defining fact of Israel's foundation in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. Israel's special role as a watchdog and attack dog for U.S. imperial interests in the Middle East, and Zionism's apartheid rule, fully backed by the U.S. Snyder's focus is the war in Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. This it is a brutal and unjust invasion. But what historian Snyder conveniently omits is the back history. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was in no small measure provoked by actions of the U.S. and West European imperialists. How so? In 1990-91, the former Soviet Union, the U.S.'s main imperial rival at the time, collapsed. And the Soviet Union's military pact with East European countries like Poland and Bulgaria also collapsed. The U.S. promised Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, that it would not expand the nuclear-armed NATO military alliance to these countries. But the U.S. went back on this promise. NATO began expanding closer and closer to Russia. Poland became a member. Romania became a member. The newly independent states of the Baltic region, which are very close to Russia's second largest city, St. Petersburg, they became members of NATO. And the U.S. continued to mount pressure. In 2014, it had a big hand in a coup that overthrew an elected pro-Russian government in Ukraine. This coup brought a pro-Western government to power, which trumpeted its determination to join NATO. Now, if Ukraine joined NATO, this would put U.S. allied forces and potentially nuclear weapons on the borders of Russia. It would be as though Mexico joined a pro-Russia military alliance and troops and weaponry were installed on the U.S.-Mexico border. The point is this: the U.S. has been surrounding Russia with hostile alliances and advanced weapon systems. Oh, poor Biden has been dealt a difficult hand. The reality is that the U.S. imperialists have in many respects forced Putin's hand. Timothy Snyder likes to describe the military conflict in Ukraine as one in which Russia, an aging tyranny, seeks to destroy Ukraine, a defiant democracy. Really? Has the U.S. sent billions and billions of dollars of weaponry, including outlawed cluster bombs, provided intelligence and logistical support, helped train and upgrade the Ukrainian military? Is it doing all of this to defend the rule of law and Ukraine's right of self-rule? Is that what motivated America's genocidal war in Vietnam with its 3 million deaths? No. America's support for Ukraine is about advancing the interests of U.S. imperialism. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin put it very bluntly. Our objective in Ukraine is to weaken Russia.
We want to see Russia weakened.
The U.S. is using this war to prevent Russia from expanding its sphere of influence and control, to maintain and extend U.S. global dominance and strengthen the NATO military alliance, and to telegraph China that the U.S. will resort to military action to safeguard its imperial interests in East Asia. As for Russia, it has its imperialist agenda to bring Ukraine back into its imperialist bloc and to establish itself as a rival pole of power to U.S. imperialism in Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East. The U.S. is waging a proxy war, an indirect war with Russia. And here is the sad but cold truth. The U.S. is using the Ukrainian armed forces and people of Ukraine as cannon fodder in pursuit of its imperial aims. In the interview you just watched, Snyder gloats about how winnable this war is for Ukraine.
Because it's a winnable war. You know, the Ukrainians did an extraordinary thing this summer and fall, which was to pin down the Russian Black Sea Fleet and begin to open a corridor for grain shipping. That's an extraordinary victory. They need more weapons faster in order to hurt Russian logistics and to be able to push across land next year.
Snyder is arguing that Ukraine can cruise along to victory provided that the U.S. ramps up its military support, including long-range missiles that could strike military targets deep inside Russian territory. This is an exceedingly dangerous situation that could rapidly escalate and spiral into direct and all-out confrontation between the U.S. and Russia, and even cross the nuclear threshold. But Timothy Snyder instructs us to ignore Russia's performance art, referring to threats by Putin to use tactical nuclear weapons.
As we go forward, what do you see as Ukraine's needs in the coming year?
That's pretty simple. I mean, so far in this war, we've allowed ourselves to be distracted by essentially Russian performance art involving nuclear war. We've allowed them to talk us into thinking that somehow we were at risk.
How telling that Snyder, propagandist for the American empire, conveniently deletes that the U.S. is the only country to have dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and that the U.S. refuses to this very day and minute to renounce the first use of nuclear weapons. As for the current war in Ukraine, on the one hand, wars involve intentions, plans, and calculations. And Russia could very well calculate, as the U.S. supplies more long-distance and lethal weapons to Ukraine, that it must take a large-scale risk and use tactical nuclear weapons to avoid significant military losses that could undermine Russia's international strength and position. On the other hand, regardless of intentions, the dynamics and unpredictable trajectory of this war could lead to unintended escalation, up to and including the use of nuclear weapons, precipitating events like U.S. and Russian aircraft or naval forces entering into accidental combat, communication systems misfiring, and nuclear tripwires unintentionally set off in the heat of such crises. And keep in mind that the U.S. and Russia own and command 90% of the world's nuclear warheads. These weapons are horrible, indiscriminate, and life-ending. Scientists have recently estimated that 5 billion people, 5 billion people could die as a result of a full-scale nuclear conflict between the US and Russia. There is no adequate medical response for the scale of this horror, no adequate fallback plan for the climate chaos and crop reduction that it would cause. We're talking about something potentially irreversible to human civilization and the planet. But Timothy Snyder, he tells us it's all psychological distraction and nuclear performance art on Russia's part. Surely he knows that the US was readying to use nuclear weapons against socialist China in 1958 and weighed the possibility in Vietnam. The hour is late, and far too many liberals and progressives either have their heads in the sand, ignoring what is shaping up in the world, or are putting their influence and energies into supporting the most exploitative and oppressive empire that has ever existed, US imperialism. Too many are swallowing the ideological Kool-Aid offered up by propagandists like Timothy Snyder, that Putin is the autocrat, America the democratic light. America has propped up and sanitized autocratic regimes all over the world, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, El Salvador, the list goes on. But they are our autocrats, serving the interest of America's blood-soaked empire. Snyder denounces Putin for genocide in Ukraine, but he's on board with Israel's genocidal slaughter carried out in Gaza. People, wake up. As Bob Avakian puts it, we can no longer afford to allow these imperialists to dominate the world and determine the destiny of humanity. They need to be overthrown as quickly as possible. And it is a scientific fact that we do not have to live this way.
That was Raymond Lotta, and he has written a polemic entitled Timothy Snyder is a vicious anti-communist ideologue and a shameless apologist for the U.S. empire, a challenge to debate. This is available at revcom.us. This brings us to the end of the 174th episode of the R&L Revolution Nothing Less show. As I said earlier on the show, next week is Thanksgiving. We're going to have a special show since Sarah and I will introduce that show for Thanksgiving, and we need you to get all your relatives together to watch that program, special R&L show, and then to really talk turkey with them about what this revolution is about, why it's necessary, why it's needed, and why they need to support this show and become patrons. And as I said earlier in the show, since Sarah's done a special segment that's going to introduce that special show, and we are going to be releasing that to patrons this coming Monday. So if you sign up to be a patron now, you're going to get an advanced view of Sansara's special segment on Joshua from the Bible and the struggle in Palestine. And last, I look forward to seeing everybody in the metropolitan New York area at the special screening of the Bob Avakian Interviews on the Lower East Side on Tuesday night, the 28th of November. And so with that, we will see you on Thanksgiving at 5 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Central Time, and 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So good night, and until next week.